Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to our side event on climate and development linkages, and which is co-organized by the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change together with CMCC and SISC in Italy. It's really nice to see that so many of you could make it the first day here at COP. So we are going to present you some of the newest results of the so-called CD Links project, which is a project that focuses on the linkages between climate policy and development policies, and particularly from the perspective of what are the main synergies and where do we see trade-offs between climate and development policies. And so this is an international research project which brings together more than 20 different international projects. It's funded by the European Commission, but includes many of the important national research teams also outside Europe. Oops, how do I, so yeah, here. I'm trying to find out how I go to the next stage, probably like this, no? Like this, yeah. So as an entry point to the pathways assessment in the project, it's of course, we are taking of course the Paris Agreement, and also recognizing that while the Paris Agreement was I would say an important step into the right direction, at the same time the Paris Agreement is at least the NDCs, the pledges from the different countries, are insufficient if you compare it with the fundamental structural change and emissions and more deeper emissions reductions that are necessary for meeting the long-term targets of the Paris Agreement, which is trying to stay below 2 degrees. So that's one of the entry points of our research. And the other entry point is the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been adopted in 2015, and which include important social, economic, but also environmental objectives beyond climate, which include objectives such as poverty, hunger, health, across different dimensions. And in our project, as I mentioned it earlier, we want to understand how action in the area of climate, particularly climate mitigation, will have implications for those different targets. And what we wanted to try to understand particularly is how stringent policies, those going towards 1.5 and 2 degrees, might interact with those other objectives, and where do we find synergies and where do we find trade-offs. I would say an important feature of the project is this collaboration between international research teams, which have been strongly involved in the providing the scientific basis, also in the climate negotiations, and a number of different national teams and national research groups. And this is particularly important for this topic because many of the SDG dimensions are particularly characterized at the local scale. So if you think about poverty eradication, hunger and food supplies, about health in rural areas, these are very much local concerns. And it's very important if you think about future climate policy designs, that we have design that takes the different local context and circumstances into account, and that we have basically a climate design which allows you to maximize the synergies, and also climate designs that is capable to avoid those possible trade-offs in some of the areas. These are the partners within the project, as you can see, and as I mentioned earlier, a number of different partners from Europe, but also important partners from China and as well as India, Japan and Korea. We are also particularly proud that we have Russian research teams on board, as well as teams from the US and from Latin America. So let me perhaps introduce quickly the agenda of speakers. So we will start with a presentation by Dr. Elmar Kriegler, who will introduce the national mid-century strategies that have been developed as part of the project with the objective towards long-term objectives towards 1.5 and 2 degrees. We will then have a second presentation by Dr. Volker Kreh, who is giving a presentation on the sustainable development implications of those pathways. And then we have a presentation by Zoe Frontisi from Greece, who gives us particularly, who zooms into the issues for the European Union. We had planned actually 2 presentations also by Ritu Mathur and Fu Sha, giving the Indian and the Chinese perspective. Unfortunately, Ritu Mathur is sick and cannot join us, and I think Fu Sha had also problems in joining us so far. So perhaps we have still a Chinese perspective. We're actually not 100% sure. But with this, let me pass on to Elmar Kriegler, and we start the presentation on the mid-century targets. Elmar.
Yeah, is this on? Now it's on. Oh, great. Yeah, thank you, Kevan, and thank you all for coming to our side event. As Kevan said, we're still hoping to have Fu Sha coming so that she can present the Chinese perspective. And but I will not try to speak longer due to the fact that Fu Sha is not yet here. So I'm from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, a bit longer name than you introduced, Kevan. This is a side event that is organized by the Potsdam Institute together with our colleagues from Italy, SISC and CMCC. And my task today is to really start it off by showing you what we did in the CD Links project in order to bring together the national modeling exercises or the national modeling work with the global modeling work. And our ultimate aim is to inform the global stocktake. We all know that the facilitative dialogue will begin in 2000, or will be performed in 2018, and then the full global stocktake is envisaged to take place in 2023. And the question is, how is this going to work, and how can science and those modeling teams that look into decarbonization pathways actually help such endeavor? And here we're presenting an example how that might happen. So one starting point we took in our project is that really the national mid-century strategies are a very important element of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, because they give a longer-term view, not only until 2030, but also until 2050, about what nations are planning to do, what their long-term national goals are. So in this capacity, they allow to first, of course, understand the alignment of the NDC in 2025 or 2030 with the long-term 2050 strategy. And supposedly this will be aligned when mid-century strategies of the countries will be proposed. But also these mid-century strategies, the national mid-century strategies, are very important for us to understand the alignment with the global ambition of reaching well below 2 degrees, or even trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. There's much more information in a 2050 emissions trajectory than only in a 2030 target in order to make that determination. So that's a second important aspect. Then we can, using these 2 elements, one can assess or evaluate the need for strengthening the NDCs and the need for maybe strengthening also the mid-century strategies as they are proposed. Also, if you as a modeling team working on decarbonization pathways are exploring the space until 2050, you have a degree of freedom to look into different decarbonization pathways, some more moderate, some more stringent, and that degree of freedom we explored in our project. So finally, what's really interesting is to compare these national mid-century strategies across countries to find out what are similarities between countries and what are differences between countries, and why are those differences. So what we did in CD Links is to we have 10 national modeling teams included in the project. They are listed up here. They're coming from the 7 top emitting regions. You can see them again listed here. So that's the EU, the US, China, India, Brazil, Russia, and Japan. So we have industrialized modeling teams from industrialized countries, modeling teams from emerging economies. And those modeling teams set out to calculate a range of scenarios, and for the scope of this presentation, 4 are relevant. One is a scenario we call it an NPI, the national policies that are implemented. So basically only looking if only implementing those national policies and continuing them thereafter, where would this lead us to without any NDCs, without any strengthening. Second scenario was an NDC scenario until 2025 or 2030 that the national modeling teams ran, and then they extrapolated this level of ambition into the future. So there was not really a progression of NDCs in this type of scenario. But the other 2 are really already representations of mid-century strategies, examples. One is an NDC progression scenario, so where you would meet the NDCs in 2030 and then progress the ambition level. And another one is a more ambitious one. We called it DEEP, where you really go to try to reach a very stringent carbon budget until 2050, and where you also would overachieve the NDCs in 2030. At the same time, the global modeling teams ran some scenarios, and these were global integrated assessment models, as you can see listed up there. So we had the same type of, the first 2 are the same type, only that we try to cover these policies on a global scale and get an idea about the collective outcome of in an NPI or an NDC type trajectory with extrapolation thereafter. Then we had this 3 mitigation pathways: a medium 2 degree, a well below 2 degree, and a 1.5 degree scenario that were run by the global models. So looking at some of looking at the results. First, I'm showing you results from the global models. That's basically the accumulated carbon emissions 2011 to 2050. But measured in terms of the emission years 2010 that you could emit at that level until the budget is exhausted. So here you can see that, for example, for the NDC, 50 years at 2010 emission levels globally would exhaust the cumulative emissions that have been emitted in the NDC trajectory globally until 2050. And as you go to a more stringent target, this number of emission years is, of course, going to decrease. So we are down to, I think I cannot read the numbers in full, 25 to 30 years for the 1.5 degree and the well below 2 degrees. Now, looking at the national modeling results, and here we really overlay the global modeling results because they also have a regional representation, so we can pick those cumulative emissions that the global models project for the national models, for the regions, with those budgets that the national models ran in their various scenarios. Here you see for the industrialized countries, where you can see that those industrialized countries are a bit below the global average. And maybe I should say that the mechanism of the project, how we talked about these regional budgets, was a discourse process. We took the global modeling results, deduced some of these regional budgets, and went to the national modeling teams and asked, is that something that you could run in your model, or do we need to make changes? And here we also need to take into account that these are should not be confused with emissions allowances of countries. So if you see these light blue bars, I'm not sure whether they can be seen. These are basically the ranges that different burden sharing regimes would give you. And you can see this lower tail for the industrialized countries, where really, depending on burden sharing regimes, they have a much lower allocation than they are adopting and emitting in these mid-century strategies. Now I'm coming to the developing countries, where you can see a higher level of emission. They're somewhat higher, but not much higher, particularly in the case of Brazil and China. India, that was an important discussion in our project, is a different country in terms of the still large development needs, particularly when it comes to energy access, the reliance on coal power. So here we can see that the budgets that were ran by the national Indian teams were higher, considerably higher than what was coming out of the cost-effective global scenarios. Now, the general strategy to decarbonize the energy system is to reduce final energy demand. That's an important measure. To decarbonize electricity, that the electricity sector is usually going first. To reduce the carbon intensity in the other fuels like solids, gases, but that is usually much more difficult than decarbonizing electricity. And therefore, electrifying energy end use, getting away from liquid, solids, gases use, is an important element of these decarbonization strategies. And what we did in the project is, since we had now these national strategies as well as the global ones, we tried to trace that in the results and see how the various regions are really using these options. So we generated electricity mixes in 2050 for these deep mid-century strategies, and I'm not don't intend to talk you through this or that you grasped all this complexity in a second. We then calculated the carbon intensity of the electricity sector in the various countries in 2050 in order to see to what extent they were decarbonized in 2050. And the basic message here is, and I hope you can see that yellow box. Should have used different colors maybe. Basically, all countries have an almost fully decarbonized electricity sector in these deep mid-century strategies in 2050, with the exception of India, which I already mentioned, where there's a substantial residual coal use in the electricity sector in those mid-century strategies that were calculated by the national teams. Talking about electrification of energy end use, and here it's really useful or it's necessary to look into the sectors. One is the industry sector, where you can see that in the NPI, if no additional climate policy is deployed, that's the triangles in this complex graph, then you are more around 20%, 20 to 25% of electrification in the industry sector by 2050. If you are in some countries, they see really ambitious electrification in the industry sector until 2050 in these deep scenarios going up to 50%. So that's highlighted by the yellow triangles here as well. Show you the example of transport. Of course, in transport, electrification hasn't come along very much, but everybody's talking about it. Electromobility. And indeed, these scenarios in the mid-century strategy see an increase in the share of electricity in transport, even in the NPI. But if you look at the deep scenarios, some see electricity shares in the transport sector up to 30%, which is pretty substantial in 2050, because that includes also the freight sector in these numbers. Doesn't mean that the freight sector is electrified. It's just in order to calculate the share, the full transport energy is taken into account. So there's a substantial fundamental changes seen in some of these mid-century strategies, and not only, and that's important, in the industrialized countries, not only in the EU or the US, but also in China, for example, here in these scenarios. Last view on the final energy development, and this highlights also the different positions where countries are at right now, and that of course needs to be fully taken into account. So you have on the x-axis the GDP per capita, and it's going to increase over time. So if you look at these dashed lines, GDP per capita is going to grow according to the assumptions in the national models. And for some countries, this means also an increase in energy demand, like for India, very pronounced. For others, it's more stable development. In the NPI scenario, meaning no additional climate policy. Just have a look now what happens if we now do these deep scenario climate policy. You can see dramatic changes to energy demand, particularly in industrialized countries. US is coming down pretty stringently. Russia is a bit different, so Russia we just see leveling off. But, and then also developing countries respond, but not as strongly, given their development needs. Now, my last segment here of results, we then try to assess the collective outcome of these national strategies. Because now we had looked into the details of them, have compared them across countries. What is the collective outcome? So this is 2010. And you see the emissions of and that's only fossil fuel and industry CO2 emissions, I should say. The 7 top emitting countries are colored. You see the color code on the right-hand side, and you can see they do have 60 to 70% of the emissions in 2010. This is going to continue in the NPI scenario. So that's 2030, and it's just no climate policy. It's just the currently implemented policies. And you would see a dramatic increase in particular the developing countries in this graph. So imposing these mid-century strategies for the top emitting countries, you can see a significant lower emissions in 2030. And if you compare that with the global results, on the right you see the well below 2 degree strategy from the global models. So in 2030, it's about in line what we find as collective outcome, meaning that it includes a strengthening of the NDCs, because usually we have this emissions gap. So these mid-century strategies we have analyzed can close that gap in 2030. And then looking quickly at the reductions in 2030, you can see that the energy supply sector is carrying the largest part in this reduction. That's basically consistent also with the national models and the global models. Now, this is 2050, so I don't know whether I can go back. That was 2030, 2050. 2050, if we don't do nothing, you see on the left-hand side, the NPI is rising, so increasing emissions from all regions. But in the deep mitigation scenario, we continue to be in line with a well below 2 degree strategy from the global model. So indeed, we have found a set of mid-century strategies that are there, whose collective outcome is in line. And finally, we also had a third scenario, as I said in the beginning, that was this NDC progression with more moderate progressions. I'll show you this one as well. And here you can see that you have larger emissions from all regions, particularly from China here and India and the US. And in these cases, we are no longer aligned with the 2 degree strategy. That is more the typical result you will get if you do an NDC type analysis with emissions gap. So we do have these 2 types of results. Finally, I'm concluding now. I guess I'm way over my time. So as I said, these deep mid-century strategies are consistent with well below 2 degree strategies, so they can be conceptualized in a way that they are consistent with 2 degrees. They include a strengthening of the NDCs in 2030. That's pretty important. The second one is they include a full decarbonization of the power sector, with the exception of India. But if you have seen from the previous graph, India has become, the red bar has become pretty large in 2050 in these deep mitigation scenarios. So India is the largest emitter due to this lack of reductions there. And finally, regional differences are there, but there are also commonalities that I discussed, and those are due to development needs, very important, particularly energy demand. Available energy resources, of course, the potentials are different across countries. And finally, also existing industry. So if we call, for example, there's a propensity for nuclear in Russia and in Japan, hotly discussed in Japan right now. And this also shows in the results out to 2050. So that's what I had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elmar. Elmar, if you want, we can take 1 or 2 clarifying questions before we continue. We will have at the end also the ample time for a discussion, but if there are immediate questions, we would have a little bit of time. Okay, if not, then I suggest there is one in the back, please. Yes.
Right, good question. So we didn't look into costs, particularly on the national modeling scenarios. Those models are partial equilibrium models, energy economy models, and don't give you full economic costs usually, right? So we can get, of course, from some of the general equilibrium global models cost estimates, which are in the typical range, the results we know already. But it's an interesting point. I think the project is still running 18 months, and then one question would be, is the regional distribution of mitigation costs we see in the global models, could that be confirmed somehow from the national modeling side? But it would require to use general equilibrium models.
Okay, one should perhaps mention also that we are in the middle of the project, and at the moment one of the activities that we have ongoing is a whole special issue which focuses on the roadmaps and decarbonization strategies of different countries. So there will be individual papers with costs and assumptions for each country and each modeling team available in due course. But let us go to the second presentation by Volker Kreh, the Deputy Director of the Energy Program at EASA, and the focus of his presentation will be on the sustainable development implication of these scenarios.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will, as already mentioned, essentially start out with the same set of scenarios that Elmar has described, so I won't describe them again here, and look at what does that mean for different sustainable development goals. So those we are essentially taking as a framing of the analysis. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to look at interactions between climate policy and all of the SDGs. We managed roughly to cover interactions to half of the remaining, so eight SDGs in total. Typically, we are looking at multiple indicators per SDG, and I should also, as a caveat, mention that we are not claiming to cover them entirely. I mean, as you will know, many of the SDGs have 10 or more sub-targets associated with them. We specifically pick up those where we see the strongest linkages or the strongest influence from climate policy. As an example, when thinking about the good health and well-being SDG, we are mostly looking at health impacts from air pollution that relate to both the land use and the energy transformation. So, yeah, so we take, as I said, climate policy as a starting point, look at implications for SDGs, but then as a next step also in those cases where we do find a risk for adverse effects, we also look at policies that can supplement kind of single objective climate policy and avoid these adverse impacts that are obviously unintended. What you see here is a very colorful graph showing you the development for in total 21 indicators that relate to eight of these SDGs. As I said, multiple per SDG typically. I'm not expecting that you read all of them, but let me walk you through the graph to give you a flavor. So first of all, what is shown is the relative change of an indicator compared to the national policy scenario. So the scenario in which we assume that current policies are implemented. And so if we now want to go to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, this specific graph shows you 1.5 degrees. What by 2050 is the relative change in this indicator? Positive values, so above the zero axis, you find adverse effects. Negative values below the zero line would correspond to co-benefits here. And yeah, speaking about the values, if you look at the left outmost bar reaches positive values up to 10. That is a biodiversity loss indicator. That means that in the most pessimistic estimate, we use multiple models here to quantify also, to look at robustness and uncertainties associated with these effects. So in the worst case, there would be a 10-fold increase in this specific biodiversity loss indicator. If you look to the rightmost figure, which is renewable energy, that would lead, here the 1.5 degrees policy would lead to a roughly 5-fold, in the most optimistic case, to roughly 5-fold increase in the share of renewables in the energy mix. So just to give you a feeling for the numbers that we are talking about here. So let me continue to walk you through this this graph, which is quite complex. So for a subset of these indicators, we find quite robustly the risk of generating adverse effects. So these are characterized by only having values above 0. And as I mentioned, we employ a set of different integrated assessment plus disciplinary models to assess these. So there is always quite a large range to take into account the most important uncertainties. Among those values, among those where we find these robust adverse effects, so where there is clearly a need for supplementary policies, are specifically mitigation strategies related to land. So food security and biodiversity are among them. On the other hand, also those that have strong distributional impacts. I mean, food, it's specifically low-income households in developing countries that are most at risk of being affected from food security issues due to climate policy. Another example from this range is access to clean and modern energy services. This is a target under SDG 7, where there is a risk that single-minded climate policy leads to increases in modern energy prices and therefore drives people back into traditional fuel use. Then we find a set of indicators where there is some ambiguity of whether we see a positive or a negative effect. And so what we can boil this down to is the specificity of the implemented mitigation strategy matters. Let me pick, for example, the water for energy column, which is one on I think the 5th from the left, if I count correctly, which has both a positive and a negative extent of the bar. So there are energy technologies that are low carbon, like wind and solar PV, that do not require, for instance, cooling water. And therefore, if you do mitigation mostly based on a transformation towards these, then there might be a co-benefit. On the other hand, there are also energy technologies that require significant cooling or that may lead to an increase in water use. For example, nuclear power might be in this range if you don't adopt dry cooling, for example. As well as a couple of other technologies. So there is, depending on the implemented strategy, either scope for positive or negative effects. And then last but not least, there is a group of indicators where we find robustly co-benefits. The classic example is air pollution, where moving away from combustion processes of fossil fuels in particular, there is usually a strong reduction significant reduction in air pollutants and therefore lower mortality due to air pollution. Also worthwhile pointing out that we find under the same SDG often indicators that have a trade-off and other indicators that have a co-benefit. As the example, I pick here the energy SDG 7, where access to clean and modern energy services is a target where we see potentially adverse effects. Simply, I mean, I mentioned the mechanism driving low-income households back into traditional fuels because modern energy will become more expensive or might become more expensive under climate policy. On the other hand, the renewable target and increasing energy efficiency is something that is clearly well aligned with climate policy. So there we find robustly positive effects. Similar on the land side, the biodiversity part I already mentioned as a potential negative or adverse effect. On the other hand, we robustly see forest area, which is one target under SDG 15, being increased, mostly as a mechanism to increase carbon stocks on land, so to sequester carbon. And the question that this begs is, how are these forests managed? Are they biodiverse forests that over time progress in terms of reaching biodiversity levels of primary forests, or are they highly managed forests that have much lower biodiversity levels than primary forests? So that's a big question here. Another example, under the sustainable consumption and production SDGs, we see large improvements in reducing fossil fuel resource use, obviously, under climate policy. At the same time, there is an indication that mineral resource use, like metals and so on, will be more required simply because the energy infrastructure based on renewable energy resources will be more resource intensive. It's mostly capital and mostly physical infrastructure that needs to be built. And the question here is how to manage these resources better, thinking about circular economies concepts, for example. Just to give you a flavor, we looked in addition to 1.5 to 2 degrees, flipping back and forth a bit. So for 2 degrees, given that in particular in the short term, the stringency of the climate policy needed to achieve 2 degrees is significantly less than 1.5, despite being quite challenging. The level of potential trade-offs as well as synergies is also significantly lower. For the remainder of this presentation, I'll move into a bit more detailed discussion on 2 specific SDGs. That's SDG 2 on no hunger, and SDG 3, good health and well-being. Looking here at the example of particulate matter 2.5 emissions, that's the biggest contributor to health impacts of energy use. What you see here is a roughly stagnating development over time. This is global level emissions in the national policy scenarios. So some decline over the foreseeable future as a result of existing air pollution policy that is expected to bring down these emissions levels in the short term, but at some point growing activity levels essentially lead to a stagnating development. If we on top of this apply the NDCs, we see some modest co-benefits, very different across regions depending on how stringent the NDCs are. And then for 2 and 1.5, a more significant reduction of PM2.5 levels. Worthwhile mentioning here that there is a relatively large chunk in the residual emissions here, also under 1.5 and 2 degrees, that relate to the use of traditional fuels in low-income households in developing countries. And unless those are tackled, it's hard to bring these numbers significantly down. And as I mentioned, we might see a trade-off here between climate policy and energy access, so the more important to integrate the two. Last topic, food security. At the moment, the FAO estimates some 800 million people being at risk of hunger. We have taken this measure and applied it to the different climate policy scenarios. First of all, I should mention how under the national policy scenario, the risk of hunger is going to develop. There is large question marks or large uncertainties associated with this because this depends on demographic development, overall economic development, institutional capacities, and so on. So there's a large error bar on this estimate. More importantly, we looked at the relative change of this indicator when putting in place climate policy. For the NDCs, we don't see a very strong signal. For 2 degrees, and in particular for 1.5 degrees, potentially a large increase. I don't want to draw a horror scenario here. As you see, the bar for this green bar for the 1.5 scenario is very large, and there are various assumptions that drive that. Yet we robustly find that there is a risk which identifies the need of looking at additional policies. That could, of course, be the most simple to implement would be food subsidies, simply keeping food prices at an affordable level for everybody. This is, of course, a very inefficient measure in the sense that one is also subsidizing those that may not necessarily need it. On the other hand, food aid or direct income transfers to low-income households would be a much more cost-effective way of implementing such a support scheme, but that requires more institutional capacity. Last but not least, here's the cost numbers that that were asked for in the previous session. These are from the global models, I should say. The ranges are, and this is consistent with the existing literature, pretty large. On left-hand side for 2 degrees, right-hand side for 1.5 degrees. What I would like to draw your attention to is the relative costs then compared to the climate policy costs of these supplementary policies to achieve energy access, to achieve food security or food access in this case. Here we looked at 2 alternative ways, as I said, food aid and food subsidy, where one is cheaper but requires more institutional capacity. And last but not least, energy for water. That's a relatively modest extra cost compared to the others. To conclude, we see in this analysis significant co-benefits as well as adverse side effects of climate policy, in particular on the land side. And when it comes to distributional issues, we see the biggest risk for having adverse effects, so that need active management, ultimately by having effective policies that are inclusive and do not look at climate in isolation. And here the policy type and the institutional capacity will determine how costly these holistic policies ultimately are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Volker. Immediate questions, comments. Yeah, I see a lot of hands going up. Let me start here in the back, please. Do we have a microphone, perhaps? I think there is a microphone. That would be great. Thank you so much.
I do have a question concerning the adverse effects that you just demonstrated us. Now, we do know that not having a climate policy at all would lead to similar effects, especially on biodiversity and also on food. So was that taken into account?
That's an important question, and we did in some cases look at it, but to have the analysis symmetric, we didn't include it in these figures. You're absolutely right, in particular when it comes to biodiversity. The option of doing nothing is likely going to produce more adverse effects than implementing the climate policy. And to be very clear, the message, we don't want to the outcome of this study to be understood in a way, don't do anything. It's just be aware of doing it the right way, rather than going into this just with the climate policy objective. But it is important that doing nothing, so the baseline, also produces in some cases even more adverse effects than what we see here as a consequence of climate policy.
I think that would be a very important message to be conveyed.
Agreed upon. Let us take perhaps multiple questions together.
Maybe to the end?
Or were all of them the same question? Yeah, here in the front, was there a question? Yeah. So. Okay.
Sorry, I have the mic if I can add my question.
Okay, then we have really many questions. So
yep.
let us, I would suggest one thing. Let us take another question now, and all others, please remember your question for the discussion at the end.
So my question is also around the land and food security implications. Did you look at different types of negative emissions technologies and how the risk altered based on the size of the overshoot and the reliance on different negative emissions and land-related technologies? Thank you.
Good question. We didn't systematically explore that yet. There is some of that is implicitly in the analysis, because the different models that are used do do apply different negative emissions options to various degrees. So it is somewhere in there, but we didn't systematically kind of scan the solution space with that in mind. But it's clearly something that would matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Volker. Let us go to the next speaker. So Zoe Frontisi will give us a perspective of the EU. Zoe is a senior researcher at the E3M lab in Greece. Zoe.
Okay. So good afternoon. I'm going to present the EU decarbonization pathways, which has been one of the core tasks that we have been dealing with in E3M lab in Greece. So the EU28 has long been a front runner in climate policies, enhancing climate mitigation both on a global and a regional level. On a regional level, the EU has endorsed a number of policy frameworks and legislative packages, and here we present a scenario that is consistent with a global well below 2 degree scenario, in line with what Elmar presented at the beginning. So we took the carbon budget that is consistent with cost-efficient 2 degree scenario. For the EU, this scenario assumes a full implementation of the European NDC, which is also in line with the various measures described in the 2030 Climate and Energy Framework. And the scenario is projected to 2050 in line with the EU roadmap to 2050. So the policies that we consider in this scenario span around 4 main types of targets. We have the overall greenhouse gas emission reduction target. For 2030, this would be 40% reduction compared to 1990 levels. And for 2050, close to 80 to 85%, which is in line also with the IPCC recommendations. Now, the overall greenhouse gas reduction target covers all gases and economic sectors, but then this is translated into an ETS and non-ETS related targets. The EU ETS is the European emission trading scheme that has been, let's say, the leading tool of climate policy since 2005 in Europe. And then we have 2 additional targets: the renewable energy target, which sees a 27% penetration of renewable energies in gross final energy demand, and the energy efficiency target. Now, these 4 targets can be achieved through a number of measures that are already or under legislation in the EU. Some examples include the CO2 standards for cars, the efficiency standards for trucks, the emission ETS linear reduction target, and so on. So here in this figure, I saw the European Commission modeling tools that are usually adopted for the impact assessments of climate policy impact assessments. So here I'm going to present only brief results from the PRIMES energy system model, which has been widely used for impact assessment in the Directorate General of Energy, Transport, Environment and Climate. But also one slide on the macroeconomic results provided by GEMI3 hybrid general equilibrium model, which has also been widely used by the European Union. So let's have a focus on the greenhouse gas emission reductions. Not sure if you can actually see the letters here, but the middle columns represent the emission reductions. The first column is the 2010 emissions, the second and the third are the reference emissions, and then we saw at the end the 2 columns for 2030 and 2050 for the well below 2 degree scenario. So here we saw that in 2030 the emission reductions for the EU are not that big compared to the reference, because already the reference scenario that lies on the current policies that are already in place is already an ambitious scenario. The EU EU28 greenhouse gas emissions have peaked before 2010. So in 2030, already in the reference scenario, we have big reductions. Nevertheless, in 2050, we find that emissions are reduced substantially, more than 70% compared to 2010 levels. And most of the emission reductions in 2030 come from energy supply sectors, and in 2050 from transport emissions. However, the remaining emissions in 2050 in the well below 2 degree scenarios mostly come from non-CO2 greenhouse gases and from remaining transport emissions, mainly related to aviation and freight emissions. Now, the EU28 decarbonization pillars that will allow this transition to the low carbon pathway are presented here, mostly indexed to 2010, both for the 2 degree scenario and the reference scenario. And we see that one of the main pillars here is the reduction of energy demand. We have a 60% reduction of energy intensity compared to 2010 levels, and the main enablers for this transition include the renovation in the building sector, the eco-design regulation, the best available technologies adoption in the industry sector, and of course more efficient energy carriers in the transport sector, like the electrification of transport demand and efficiency standards. Another very important decarbonization pillar is the penetration of renewable energy sources in final energy demand. Here we saw primary energy demand, which reaches almost 60%, and we have the renewable energies that are prominently developed in the power sector, mostly wind and solar energy, but also we find that offshore wind is widely developing, especially due to cost reductions towards 2050. Renewables are also developing in the heating and cooling sector, but to a lower pace. And we find, of course, that a big share in primary energy demand, renewable renewable energy, is due to biofuel penetration in transportation, as we find that this is the most economically viable way to use bioenergy is in the transport sector and not so in power supply. Now, another very important decarbonization pillar is the electrification of final energy demand, which was touched upon in previous presentation as well. Now, the electrification of final energy demand mainly comes from 2 sectors. This is the transport sector, where we find that in 2050, the electrification of transport quadruples from the reference levels, reaching 16% of total final energy demand. And also in the building sector, where more electric appliances are used for heating and cooling purposes. And the final decarbonization pillar is, of course, the decarbonization, almost entire decarbonization of the power sector. We see that the carbon intensity of the power supply sector in Europe in the 2 degree scenario in 2050 almost goes to 0. And this is due to a very high penetration of renewable energies, also some deployment of CCS technologies, and a stable share of nuclear power. We see that fossil fuels are almost 0 in 2050 in the 2 degree scenario for Europe. Now, we have also analyzed the macroeconomic impacts with the GEMI 3 scenario. I will only give a very brief presentation here of some of these results. We have here the decomposition of the GDP impacts, and we see that we know that moving to a low-carbon pathway requires drastic transformation of production processes and consumption preferences. Usually these carry a cost, but this cost also depends on the type of policies that we use, but also differs on a regional level. So here we find that for the EU28, the macroeconomic impacts greatly depend on the level of climate action that major trading partners take. And this, of course, affects the EU28 competitiveness. So on the left-hand column, we find the global implementation of NDC scenarios. And on the right hand is a global well below 2 degree scenario. And here the results are for the EU28. So we see that in 2030, both scenarios have adverse effects for GDP and employment levels. This is mainly due to a reduced private consumption, but also due to a reduced EU28 competitiveness. But in 2050, if the right policies are taken, we find that in the global 2 degree scenario, there could be beneficial effects, especially for the employment levels, but also for the overall GDP impacts, mainly due to the reduction of imports from for fossil fuels, but also because the EU28 energy-intensive sectors are already very energy efficient and less carbon intensive in the reference scenario, so they can gain a competitive advantage in the decarbonization pathway scenario. Now, of course, an important caveat that should be highlighted here is that we do not take into consideration any potential co-benefits from climate policies, neither the avoided climate damages, as discussed previously. These are not taken into consideration, and this could be one reason explaining why we see adverse effects in the NDC scenario and in 2030 results. Thank you very much.
We have time for clarifying questions, comments. Yes, please. Yeah, it would be great if you could go to the microphone.
Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if you look at, for example, sometimes, let's say, decarbonization strategies that basically the pressure is exported to other countries, was that considered, like the fair share, basically?
Is the question on the macroeconomic impacts mainly?
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's say whatever the decarbonization that's going on in the EU could be basically moved to other areas, let's say.
Yeah, so these two scenarios were consistent with decarbonization policies in all countries. So the second scenario was a global well below 2 degree scenario, and the first scenario was a scenario where all NDCs are implemented. So whatever each country has pledged in the Paris Agreement. So yes, in some cases, Europe may lose exporting capacity, but this will have, let's say, a contradictive effect in the European disposable income. So we don't expect that EU imports will increase from other regions, because also the disposable income of Europe might fall. So yes, we do take into consideration the change in trade competitiveness.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I'm actually really happy that I can also announce Fu Sha. Great, welcome. I'm really glad that you could make it. So Fu Sha is with the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation of China, to give us some reflections on the Chinese and the Chinese perspective.
So thank you so much. So thank you for inviting me here to have the opportunity to share something regarding China's mid-century strategy and China's thinking regarding China's long-term strategy to you. So for us, you know that the China's mid-century strategy actually is now still under development. So we still on the state on the stage for the analysis. So since 2013, actually, China has launched a very big project. We call it the micro-strategic study on China's low-carbon strategy. So it's the project already finished by the year 2015. But there are several. Yeah, we think it is a good basis actually for China's development of its mid-century strategy. But however, there are several problems regarding the studies. So there are some shortcomings. So for example, the existing analysis actually mainly focusing on the energy system. So, but now we feel more and more important that if we want to achieve big reduction in the year 2050, maybe we still need to think in something outside of the energy system. And the second is the previous study is mainly focusing on the contribution of China's development of NDC actually. So how China will decrease its emission rapidly after the peaking. So after the year 2030 actually is very weak. So we still need to enhance the study after 2030, and also the existing study actually has very weak analysis regarding the social economic impact and the linkage with other aspects like the SDGs. So for this kind of reasons, now China are thinking to considering to launch another study or other studies regarding its mid-century strategy. So which means that the study is now still underway. But here I would like to share some initial thinking from our institution, because our institute actually is a government think tank, so we do modeling studies as well. So here I would like to share something regarding our thinking on China's long-term strategy and with you. So actually we share a lot of thinking as the decarbonizing strategy as pointed out by the previous speakers. So for example, the decarbonization of the electricity, the power sector, and to enhance the electrification rate of the end-use sector. So there are two bigger strategy as opposed by IPCC AR5 as well. So we also share the thinking to reduce the final energy use. So it's based on the restructuring of energy economic, and also the adoption of the energy efficiency measures. And also we share the thinking regarding the decarbonization of the residual liquids, soil and oil, that part cannot be electrified. But here I would like to highlight some kind of thinking we think it's especially important for China. So for example, the first one is that we think that to what extent China could find an innovative development pathway. So to what extent China would be able to restructuring its economy. For us, we think, and to pursue an innovative development pathway, for us, it's very important for the China's future energy use and the GHG emissions. So maybe it's not the same as the other developed countries like the EU or European Union or US, because it's the structure of economy is already keep stable for a lot of years. But for China, we are now at a tipping point to restructuring. So you know that China is now pursuing a new normal economy, and China is conducting a lot of reform in the supply side. So we think that to which extent China will be succeeded in pursuing a new normal economy and to make its supply side reform successful, that will be very important. So we make some kind of estimation. So if China delayed its restructuring, like the phasing out of energy-intensive industries, like the iron steel, like the cement, then because if China succeeded in that such kind of reform, so we assume that China, the industry emission, the peaking of industry will peak before 2020. So it will prior to other sectors like the transportation and like the buildings. But if China failed to restructuring such kind of sectors, actually there will cause a lot of lock-in effect, and there will postpone the picking of the industry sector maybe as far as 5 years at least. And secondly, my second point is regarding the interaction between the climate change and the SDGs. So there are, although China take a lot of actions in climate change, but to be honest, that the climate change issues is far from the mainstreaming issues in China. So the policymakers, they are caring about other issues like the air pollution, like the economy. So these kind of issues are more important than climate change in China, to be honest. So we really find out that it will be very important for us to establish linkage between the climate change and other development agendas. So if we want to persuade the policymakers to take action, so we need to tell them that how many new employment could be created if you take climate change actions, and how many new investment you will have, and how many air pollution you could be reduced simultaneously. So such kind of information, as pointed out by Volker, I think we think it's very important for us, and we already conduct such kind of analysis to see that if China could pursue its national determined contribution target, and if China could pursue a long-term low emission strategy, and how much it could be reduced, and how much employment and investment it could be created. And for us, it's not, the co-benefits and the trade-offs, as I mentioned, is very important. But it's not only a problem of the co-benefit and the trade-offs. For us, it's more important. It's a problem of optimization of the multi-objectives. So it's a problem of integrated thinking, and it's not only to thinking the pieces one by one, but we need to combine them together. So for us, I think how to establish linkage between the climate change and other agenda items. So it's of great importance for us. And my third point is regarding the interlinkage between the short-term action and the target with the long-term ones. So for China now, for China as similar as a lot of other countries. Now we have the national determined countries. We need to update and renew our targets every 5 years. And we also have the task to preparing the long-term strategies. But if we combine them together, we will find there might be some trade-offs. So if we only looking at the short-term target, and then we pursue actions to achieve the short-term target, then we will face some problem like the lock-in effect. So if we only focusing on the low-hanging fruit to achieve the short-term target, but for the long term, then you will face a lot of lock-in problems, like if you investment in the infrastructure. So such kind of issues we find more and more important. So we think that according to China's studies, that we find out that if we failed to thinking about this kind of linkages and the cumulative emission from the year 2010 to the year 2050 may be as large as 80 gigaton. So the 80 gigaton is a huge number. It's almost 2 years of emission of the world. So we really think that we need to establish linkage between the short and the medium term with the long term as well. And my final point is regarding the issues as I just mentioned, so the linkage between the energy system and the others. So now from the targets, the China's target, the NDC, the 2020 target, all focusing on the energy system. So we have the intensity target, we have the peaking target, we have the share of non-fossil fuel. So this kind of most of our target in other side, we have some target regarding the land part, but the forest part. But the majority of our target is focusing on the forest energy system. But we felt that there is a lessons learned actually from EU and the US. So if we want to reduce our emissions to a big extent by the year 2050 or thereafter, so we will find out that even we decarbonize the energy system to a very low extent, but the residual part is still very large. So for the non-fossil fuel, for the non-CO2 GHG, and for the land use part, so we are now pursuing study regarding that part. But for China, it's not easy because the databases and the research basis regarding that part is very weak. So we want to cooperate with the other global institutions like YASA, like the PIK, and they have very good practices and very good expertise in that part. So we hope we can work together in the near future. So that's my briefing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fu Sha, for giving us also the Chinese perspective. I think we had really interesting and analytically also very deep presentations. At the one hand, showing us how national roadmaps and decarbonization pathways can be aligned with the global transition towards well below 2 degrees in the long term. We heard also about potential risks and side effects of deep decarbonization, but also showing that with smart and inclusive climate policy, one can actually avoid those trade-offs. So these are risks which can be avoided. They occur on different time frames than the avoided impact. So that's why it's important to understand, if we do climate mitigation, what sort of risks do we have in the near term and how can we avoid those risks to align them with the SDG objectives. And then finally, we had I think, really interesting presentation on the pillars of decarbonization in Europe. So we have roughly around 15 minutes left for an open discussion and for your feedback. We had lots of hands up there previously, so now it's a good time to raise the question. And please come to the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Michiel Schaefer. I'm with Climate Analytics. I have to come back to the earlier issue of the risks and the costs of the different scenarios. I'm not going to repeat an earlier question because I thought that point was well made. I want to hear a little bit more from Volker about 2 elements you mentioned in your talk. First, holistic policies. We need holistic policies to mitigate the risks associated with certain policies. I do think we also then need, let's say, holistic assessments, taking into account some of these things. And in particular, the other point that you were making, which is very important, I believe, is the distributional effects. And we know, of course, that in the climate impacts, those distributional effects are also extremely important, in particular for poorer communities at risk of the direct climate effects, and then of the risks associated with mitigation policies, which I might add not only play a role at mid-century level, but we see that there are also present-day impacts on more vulnerable communities in the world, and that you also see that climate stringent policies and baseline scenarios in the impact world start to diverge in the 2020s, 2030s already. So it's not only a matter of the longer term. And then one specific question, maybe for clarification, Volker, for explanation. How does it work in these studies, in these models, in terms of what happens with, for example, the revenues from carbon pricing? How does it, let's say, flow into the rest of the model and including, let's say, mitigating these negative effects?
Yeah, thanks. These are very important points. I mean, in particular, I think you pointing out the distributional effects being important both on the side of climate impacts as well as on the side of potential mitigation policies. I mean, protecting vulnerable communities from both the impacts of climate change and the impacts of climate policy, which typically is there to discourage behavior that, I mean, consumption of emission incentive goods for goods and services, but to a minimum degree these are just needed to support essentially decent living standards. So I think that's a very important point. I also agree on the timescales. We actually picked 2050 here because it aligns well with the mid-century strategies, and that's where the effects kind of play out kind of the strongest. We did the same analysis for 2030 as well, and the magnitude of the effect is smaller because climate policy hasn't at that stage, at least in the pathways that we've looked at, isn't at that level of stringency, but the direction of the effects is actually similar. And it makes, of course, sense to look at 2030 because that's the time horizon that the SDGs are actually focusing on. So, and the NDCs are talking about 2030. So that point is also well taken. Last but not least, how is this all integrated? I mean, I should mention we are not employing here a monolithic model that does everything in one go. We have a set of integrated assessment models, and some of these have a better representation for looking at land-related issues because they have a dynamic land model that takes into account competition over land, agriculture, forestry, other services. Then we have general equilibrium frameworks. So the model that Zoe, for instance, is running is also capable, is a general equilibrium model that can look at employment effects of climate policy. And that is one specific case where we looked at different recycling options, and maybe Zoe wants to comment on this, because it does in fact matter for employment, but I mean, generating also, more broadly speaking, revenues for then supporting these supplementary schemes that we may need. But I have to admit, it's, as I said, it's not everything is kind of fully closed and monolithic, but we've rather kind of chosen to use models according to strength and according to their strength. Do you want to maybe say a few words?
Just a quick comment on the recycling. We find that this is very important, and we actually did some research on the holistic approach of what could mitigate the adverse effects of climate mitigation policies, and we see that the level of the revenues from carbon taxation is actually very high. It can reach 3% of global GDP. So this is a lot of money, and depending on how each government uses it, we see that, for example, what we did was recycling this amount of money back to the economy by reducing the social security contribution paid by firms or households. So this would eventually increase employment levels more than what is seen in a reference case, because the companies themselves would see a lower labor cost. So how we use the revenues from carbon taxation is very important. Yeah.
Let us perhaps take a few comments at the same time. I think there is no comment. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Susanna Galzamiglia. I had a question for Volker, and the first graph that you have with the indicator, which is a multiplier of different, and we get different columns. And I found that my attention was attracted to the big columns, but I wondered if the small columns on the adverse effects wouldn't tell us quite a few interesting things. I was interested to hear your thoughts on that. I mean below 1, where the absolute value of the indicator is between 0 and 1.
just, okay, you wanted to take multiple questions? Or?
We could take more because of the time. But otherwise, if this is the only question at the moment, Volker, go ahead.
Yeah, just, oh, sorry. Just asking back, I'm afraid I'm not fully in control. That's the third presentation. This is the one, right, that you were referring to. So are you more speaking about the co-benefit part or the smaller trade-offs, and I mean the ones that are smaller in magnitude here?
I was referring to the adverse effects where you have a value between 0 and 1, which I understand would mean a reduction of the adverse effects. Is that what you had?
No, yeah, maybe I haven't fully explained the graph. I mean, above the red line, so the 0 line, everything that is above is an adverse effect, and everything that is below is a co-benefit, and just the magnitude is then possibly smaller than in the other cases. But I mean, this is I mean, let me say a few more words on here. I mean, there is really. And we've been struggling with this when putting the figure together. It really, I mean, the magnitude of the effect can largely vary here. For instance, if you look at a forest area, there we see actually several hundreds of million hectares additional forest area as a mitigation co-benefit, as it is displayed here. Yet the total forest area is in the thousands, I think 3,000 to 4,000 million hectares. So therefore, the effect, while in absolute terms being actually large, if you relate it to the overall forest area, it's actually quite small. The same, I mean, similar example would be unemployment. So we've been also experimenting there with different indicators. So the total unemployment or the unemployment rate is the change in those is what we've shown here in the end. You could also show the same normalized to employment, but then because your denominator gets much larger, the effect gets much smaller. So in a way, one has to be a bit careful in interpreting the magnitude of this of these indicators, because it is just a relative change and depends on also then the base development. It is the main message that we think it should convey is that there are some areas where that are more prone to risks of climate policy generating adverse effects, and that definitely need attention to manage those well so that they don't unfold in reality, while in other cases that might be less so. Or you may want to actually think about how to implement a certain policy. I mean, the water example, I think water for energy, I explained, where you could, depending on the portfolio of options that you ultimately pick, could either generate through climate policy a co-benefit or an adverse side effect. So again, a holistic view is needed to make the right choices in light of a broader sustainable development framing.
You would have some time still for additional questions or comments. Yes, please, go ahead.
It stays a bit in that topic frame, and again, it's to Volker. I mean, you still got 18 months in the project, and you already said that you didn't take into account avoided climate damages, but the question, or most interesting also for me, would be whether at all a comparison could be made in terms of scale, maybe on some of these categories, especially those who stand out biodiversity loss and risk of hunger, even on a longer time scale. I mean, you rightly mentioned the disconnect between timescales 2030, obviously immediate effects, avoided climate damages really unfolding over the century and beyond, just for comparison purposes, because again, you know, we're scientists, but politically speaking, obviously this slide shown as such without a longer, you know, in a sense, explanatory note could of course be misused by parties not interested in, let's say, global well-being, put it really broadly, really not interested in pursuing the SDGs. So just wondering to what degree this could be put into context with maybe a follow-up within the project as part of the final report. Thank you.
My name is Aman. My question is that you call these scenarios NDC scenarios, but they're just taken, like the part of that is concerned with the numbers in the NDCs, so there's nothing about the adaptation that is mentioned in NDCs. Then how do you think that if you somehow could quantify it, I must call it so difficult. I mean, I think it is then in line with the fact that this is these models are not CBAs and you are not having climate damages. But do you think then this adaptation part could somehow change again the results, or how this could happen? Yeah, thanks.
Volker, do you want to respond?
I can try at least to respond to the first question. It is, we have actually looked, for example, in case of the biodiversity assessment, we've also looked at climate impacts. They are just not in this specific graph. And the response is by 2050, which was kind of the only time horizon where we had both the biodiversity assessment and the mitigation assessment side by side. It depends on which species you're looking at. In some cases, the climate impact seems to be stronger. In some cases, the mitigation policy seems to be stronger. I should also caveat the biodiversity assessment in the sense that here we've applied one specific model. In some of the other indicators, there are up to, I think, 8 different models in there. We've done some parametric uncertainty analysis with that model that it ultimately then generated these large bars. But yeah, on the 2050 time horizon, I would say probably they are both the climate impacts and the mitigation signal that we saw both the same order of magnitude. Of course, the further you go out in time, the impact side would become more and more dominant. And that's maybe an important thing to keep in mind and also to communicate. Shorter term, it looks probably different, where the climate policy impact could be kind of more disruptive. On the food security side, I've seen there are some papers out there that claim that the mitigation impacts could be larger, yet I'm not sure to which degree the assessments are actually capable to really take on board extreme events, because that might be ultimately the real game changer for on the food security and productivity, agricultural productivity, and so on. So. But I think your point is well taken, and it needs to be taken into account when communicating these wherever the impact side is relevant in the game.
Okay, if I may add, perhaps actually, if you could show the next slide, that would be wonderful. The next slide itself. Okay, the next slide. Oh no, the final slide. Absolutely fine. This one, yeah. Back. This one. I think this is the main story that we did not emphasize enough. So this is the so the project didn't stop at looking at the risk of the adverse side effect. It looked actually also into measures how we can align these objectives. And if you look at these bars, these are the costs of aligning them, and the cost for avoiding negative effects on energy access, food, and water are much smaller than the transformational cost of the mitigation itself. So we are not talking about physical laws, right? We're talking about an effect that we need to understand and we need to avoid. So I think there is also a positive message here, that while the risks are real and the concerns need to be taken serious, we can avoid them. I think that's really an important message. Okay, Elmar, do you want to add some wise words at the end?
Yeah, no wise words, but just to picking up on 2 points. One is obviously the discussion of how to really have a integrated view on both the impacts, the co-benefits, as well as the mitigation costs. That's a long-standing issue since decades. Also a long-standing issue for the IPCC, and we need to get better here. But at the same time, we also need to allow for being able to show such results and then being able to contextualize them. Because as a matter of fact, if you want to show everything and do everything right, that's a very tall order. And some things the models can do well, and others they cannot do well. And so there's value of focusing on those, but not claiming that those results that we see here then would mean that if you don't do climate policy, we would not have these adverse effects, right? So we kind of need to be able to take this into account and make sure that when we talk about climate impacts, get also the latest results here, even though if they don't include mitigation. There was a question on the distributional implications. Those are critical. The distributional impacts for measuring for the social cost of carbon, for the quantity of climate impacts, they probably also play a large role on the mitigation side. But I think that's a good approach to really use horses for causes and try to integrate where possible. And to my understanding, that's also the approach that was used here in CD Links by Volker and the teams to really look into sector models that can speak to a specific topic. The second element I want to mention, not related to many of the questions, but I think that is interesting with the project, is that we really have these national and global modeling teams involved here. So we have a discussion process in the project itself. So there were many good questions here from the audience, like, okay, what about carbon dioxide removal technologies? Are they really they will be changing some of the land adverse side effects? And how are national modeling teams seeing actually carbon dioxide removal technologies compared to how the global models are using them? So we do have some national modeling teams that use them. And that also in some of the mid-century strategies they are deployed, like for Brazil, and in others, like for Europe, they are not used. And that's a very interesting discursive process that for us researchers help us to first be better able to compare our work, also get a common understanding, not the same opinion, but a common understanding about the critical issues. And I think this understanding will be very, very valuable for informing the global stocktake and then also informing the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, we are a little bit over time, so let's give the presenters a hand, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you.